Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Spitz-Cohan, Executive Director of Film Pittsburgh, and welcome to our Q&A with Keren Ben-Horin, who is the co-creator of the film Mrs. G. Keren, I'm so excited to talk to you today because I thought the film was fascinating and I want to learn absolutely everything I can about Mrs. G. She was such a trailblazer, but let's start first with where were you born and how did you get into filmmaking? Although I'm not really, you'll tell us.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such a
Sure.
pleasure. So my background is in fashion design. And I then kind of veered into academic work in fashion studies. And this film was very much born out of sort of like my interest in fashion history and my research. And it's based on my MA thesis. And for this film, I collaborated with Ayala Raz, who you see in the film. She's the other fashion historian, and she was actually my college professor way back in Israel, where I was born and raised, and I went to fashion school there, Shinkar School for Engineering and Design. And she was my professor, and she introduced me to the work of Leah Gottlieb when I was a student. And later on, Ayala and I, when I was already living in New York and working in the fashion industry and also going to FIT to do my master's degree, Ayala and I worked on an exhibition in Israel on Leah and on her work. And then that exhibition, I brought to a version of it to New York. And after that, Ayala and I really we've never had a chance to put together a catalog. And so we wanted to write a book. And while working on the proposal, I came up with this idea that it could be really interesting to kind of focus on her life story and how it related to her design sensibility. And Ayala kept pushing and saying, the more we work on it, it sounds more like it could be a fascinating documentary. And I, at the beginning, really objected to that. But then I was kind of like, let's try it.
Why did you object to it? What was your thinking?
I think like when you work on a book, whether by yourself or with another person, you have control over almost everything. And when you're making a film, there's so many people involved, and you need a director and a producer, and there's like a broadcasting, body that has a say. And so I was a little bit reluctant to let go of that control. But we did put together this kind of an outline or initial script. And Ayala at the time was studying community television, and her teacher ended up being the producer of the film. And so he brought along the lead, Kimor, who's the director. And that's how the film came to be realized.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Mrs. G for a second. I can't stop calling her that. Her name is Leah Gottlieb.
Yeah.
But I think that, that's part of the reason that I love the film so much is that I really identified with her in so many ways, but yet her in other ways, not at all. She escaped the Holocaust with two young children from Hungary. She was really a trailblazer, a pioneer, in that she put the fashion industry on the map in Israel. And I remember these bathing suits that my mother would wear that were so out there and fashion forward. And
Yeah.
so the thing in the movie where she's just she looks like a very petite woman, very, I just, it's so astonishing to me to learn about the conflicts within her, that she was not a good mother, that she was snobby and only wore, you know, um, clothing by designers that were very different from her, I think. Is that an accurate statement?
I think, one of the things that are fascinating about her is exactly all of those conflicts. And I think, the more I studied her, the more mysterious she became to me.
Interesting.
Because, I think the lit and I, when we had a lot of conversations about her when we were working on the film, and the lead said something very interesting. She said that she was kind of trying to figure out who she was, what was the driving force, and she said, the lead said, she has this fire for
Mhm.
creating, and I think that was her driving force. She's like an artist. She had to do what she did,
I
and
absolutely had that feeling that this is a woman who's an artist. Yes, she makes bathing suits and was the first to use Lycra. Yes, yes, but she was an artist. She was a visionary. She was a
exactly.
creative person.
Hmm. Hmm. She
Yeah.
just it was the thing that, when I had a privilege of meeting her many times when I was essentially, at the very beginning, doing the research with Ayala, um, way back when I was a student in Israel. We used to visit her every week and catalog all of those, a lot of the bathing suits that ended up, now they're in the collection of the Hulon Design Museum. And she said this was after her husband passed away, her daughter passed away, Tommy passed away. She had to sell the company. There was a lot of emotions, and she said that work is what keeps her going. She, gets up in the morning and she's working. And I think, that was the thing that kept her alive, kept her sane, and allowed her to fight a lot of the demons that she had from the Holocaust, from her. She had a very troubled childhood. So I think all of those things, work allowed her to cope with those things.
Hmm. Well, it's also interesting that, you know, I mean, I think about these things all the time as a woman running a business, a nonprofit business. You know, just thinking about the life work balance. I mean, what I do is not a 9 to 5 job; it's my life, and I think that um, for her, it certainly was that, to the detriment of her children. And, um, I fortunately don't feel that way towards my daughter. I just have one, but I really try to be the best mother I could be also while working. Can you talk a little bit about what you know about her relationship with her children? I think that what's in the film tells me that they stayed with her. Even though the relationships were difficult, and Miriam, the one daughter that um, went to New York, she still stayed with the company, with the family business. So I think that a lot of family relationships are perhaps difficult, and yet there's still a lot of love there. And that's the sense that I got. Could you talk a little bit about her relationship with her
Yeah.
children?
Yeah. I think, it was a complicated relationship, like all families are. And, I often wondered, like, if she was a men designer, would we have the same film? Will we talk about the same, would we even analyze this relationship if she was not a woman? And she was very
No.
much a woman of her time. Like, I think if she would have been a designer now, she may have not even chose to have children. But at the time, that's what you did. You got married and you had children. And so she kind of followed that. I think, Miriam and Judith were both it was a very tight knit family. They were very close to each other. It was sort of like, it was not even a question if they would or would not join the business. They grew in the business. Miriam told me that when they were children, they would go on weekends and, package the bathing suits. It was just part of their life. She didn't, until she was a teenager or a grown woman, she didn't think it was weird to do that on weekends. It was just part of, how the
What they
family,
did.
what they did. And she also, when they came to Israel after the Holocaust, they came with Leah's mom. So she took care of the
Oh.
girls. Um, and they were very, very close to the father. He was apparently a very charming, very sweet man. And they were very, very, very close to him. So I think Miriam today probably sees her relationship with her mom in a different way. They always admired her greatly and respected her very, very much. And she was sort of like the captain of the ship, she was the one who sort of like led the family and led the business. And there were no boundaries between family and business. It was really, there were really no boundaries for good and bad,
Mm-hmm. And can you speak at all to Mrs. G's legacy in Israel? Do people, I mean, is she a household name? Do people still know the name? Or is it just from a certain time? Do
It's a
you?
really good question. I think, the film had a much better reception in the US than it did in Israel. And I think, in the US, every woman, above the age of 45 knows Gothics. Everyone knows it. I think the name in Israel is known, but not necessarily her story. I think after the exhibition, more people know about her and her life's work and how important she was. In terms of a legacy, I think, you know, um, at the time, sort of like at the heyday of Gothics, it was for sure sort of like the crown jewel of the Israeli industry. And the government, as Ayala explains in the film, the government did everything it could to kind of preserve that. They gave them funds, they forgiveness for debt and all of that, just to keep the company running. But the industry has changed considerably in Israel. There is actually no industry in Israel. I mean, there are designers, but there are no fabric manufacturers. There are very, very few factories. It's a
Why do
very
you think that? Why do you think that is, Karen?
it's complicated, but it essentially in the 1980s, the government cut subsidies and support for the local industry. And at the same time, you have the rise of sort of like Asian manufacturing, where it was no longer economic really to produce
Right.
in Israel
Gotcha.
anymore. And with the kind of
Gotcha.
globalization of the fashion industry, all of that, without the government support, those factories were not competitive to,
Gotcha.
overseas manufacturing. So at the end of the day, the industry in Israel is very different today than it was. But I would say that the one thing that I think Gothics contributed in terms of sort of like the one thing that remains is this idea that to look at your surrounding for inspiration, to look at Israel, to look at the history, to look at the colors, to look at the landscapes. I think she was, along with Mesquite and Roji Ben Yosef and a small number of designers that were working at the same time, they were really starting to look inward rather than trying to sort of like compare to Paris or London or New York in terms of the fashion sort of like style. They really kind of search for, what's unique about us, what in our sort of like traditions, in our crafts, in the things that are here that we can draw from to create this product that no one else has. And I think that is the big legacy of Leah Gottlieb.
Yeah, I read somewhere, and or maybe it's even in the film. I don't recall where, but that flowers really helped Mrs. G get through the Holocaust, and that's why many of her designs featured big, bold flowers. And I love that. We're almost out of
Actually,
time. I wanted
okay.
just to ask you
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, you have
No,
something to say?
I
Yeah,
have
fine.
like a little bit of like a behind the scenes
Oh,
about
yeah,
this. So
yeah,
there's in the film, there's
yeah.
this her story about the daisies, how she used the daisies to sort of like cover her face, and sort of like that helped her visit Armin. When Ayala was doing most of all of the research on her early period and the period of the Holocaust, and she actually found out that if you kind of cross-reference, the ages of the children, the way she cites them and the places and all of that, actually the story doesn't kind of compute. And I don't think she was lying. I don't think it was intentional. I think it's her way of sort of like making something horrible into something beautiful. And so her kind of, I think her, the way she approached design as well as her own history was in this lens of fantasy. And if
Mm,
you look at Gothics on how the collections were put together, it was, she created this world of beauty, of colors, a world that takes you somewhere else, right? With all this like the figures, and it's always, there's a theme that kind of draws you to this other world. So I think it was, from my perspective and my research, I think it was a coping mechanism.
interesting. Yeah. Wow, that is so fascinating, and I'm glad that you brought up. I'm glad that you told that story because, you know, I think she was really smart, and it worked. It worked. It got me. I loved that story, and
Mm-hmm.
so even if it is not 100% true, somehow it was her fantasy or her
It's
way of
true in her
coping.
mind. In her mind, it's completely true.
Mhm.
And with her daughter, she they didn't know anything about her time during the Holocaust, and in fact, I was the one who told Miriam how her parents met. She didn't know. She Leah Gottlieb was very, very secretive. She didn't want to open those wounds. It was kept close. She didn't want to talk about it. And Miriam didn't even know that her mother gave the testimony that we see in the film.
Right,
It was the first time
right.
she saw it. She knew nothing of it. Um, talk about like a complicated person. So, she was holding a lot inside.
Yeah. Well, listen, Karen, I cannot thank you enough for, you know, taking the steps slowly but surely over time, over years, and sharing this with us because the beauty of film is that you're able to learn so much, and film is such a mass appeal. Everybody loves a good movie, and this film for me really opened up a lot of thoughts and questions, and really introduces us to somebody that we may have heard about or not. For younger people, maybe not, but it really gave me a window into this woman's life, and I'm greatly appreciative to you and your team for bringing this to us. I know the film has been shown many, many places. We were set to show the film at last year's Jewish Film Festival here in Pittsburgh, and we're just grateful that we can do it this time around, albeit virtually. So I want to just say thank you for
Thank
being
you.
with us today, and to our Film Pittsburgh audience. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will see you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you.